I'm excited to introduce Megan Roddie, who is a researcher at IBM and is also in our SANS Master's program. And Megan has supported a variety of different efforts, both in the public and the private sectors, and is bringing to you today an amazing perspective on automation, specifically looking at incident response in the Google environment, Google Workspace. Of course, as more cloud-focused, cloud-based services become so tightly integrated into our business operations, it's inevitable that you're going to have to do incident response there. So Megan is actually bringing us not only some approaches for that, but also how to do that at scale. Because let's face it, we are not going to go backward in terms of the amount of data and the amount of users that we have to work with in incident response. So scalability becomes absolutely critical there. So I know she's got a little bit of an introduction in a moment, so I don't want to steal that thunder, but I'm really, really excited for this talk, and I hope that you are as well. So that all being said, Megan, please jump on here and take it away. Thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge with us.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction, Phil. Okay, so quick introduction of me. I don't want to talk too much about myself. I'm sure you all are capable of Googling me if you really want to know more. But my name is Megan Roddie. I work as a cyber threat researcher at IBM, as mentioned, and I provide part-time support to our development team as a Python developer focused on automation engineering, building tools for our threat analysts and threat hunters to make their jobs more efficient, which is kind of along the lines of the work I did here. My first master's degree was in digital forensics, and as Phil mentioned, I'm currently a master's candidate for the SANS Masters in Information Security Engineering with a special focus area in incident response. So diving right into the content, when I set out to do this research, which was actually a part of my first white paper for my master's degree, my goal was to increase incident response capabilities in Google Workspace. Though I'm a threat researcher now, in past roles, I worked incident response and SOC operations jobs, and I had encountered incidents involving Google Workspace before, which if you search my name on YouTube, you'll find a couple talks about incident response at a higher level in Google Workspace, so those experiences I had. And what I found was that there is a need for a better view of log data in Google Workspace and a need to enrich that log data for more context. Just hopping into the Windows pane was not providing the data we needed at a level that would help incident responders. Right now, over 6 million businesses are subscribed to Google Workspace. Often it gets overshadowed by Microsoft O365. So there's plenty of research out there on Microsoft O365, not so much on Google Workspace from an incident response perspective. Surprisingly, if you log into the admin panel, there's no centralized log view. You have to click into each section of logs, and we'll go over to kind of what those categories are later. But the login logs are separate from the Google Drive logs, are separate from the email logs. And so one major problem is not having that big picture. Obviously, as incident responders, a lot of the time we want a full timeline that we can review, and that's not provided by Google. And a caveat to this before I continue, all of this research is based on the lowest tier level of Google Workspace. Having worked with a lot of small and medium businesses in the past, I wanted to focus on giving tools to those who are subscribing at that lowest level tier, not the higher cost enterprise tiers. So there may be in the enterprise tier some log views and some capabilities that I'm unaware of, that you can pay more for, but I want to be able to help those incident responders who are working with the people paying $7 a month instead of $20 a month per person. Because of this lack of centralization and the lack of context, it leads to a lot of manual work of gathering the logs for incident responders, which leads to increased response time. Obviously, not a good thing. So given my background in current work position working with Python automation, I decided to approach this by writing a tool in Python that interfaces with the Google Admin SDK in order to pull the logs, and then uses pandas to take that data, organize it, filter it, get the relevant information. And finally, at this time, the main enrichment that's provided that we'll go into later is the MaxMind GeoLite 2 database. So I use that Python library in combination with the MaxMind database to geolocate any IPs we pull. Just a quick overview of the tool structure. Obviously, if you don't know programming, you don't really need to know exactly what all this structure is. But basically, you see there's a bunch of functions to get the different activity types, to get the geolocation, and eventually to consolidate all the logs. And the goal at the end is to have an output in an Excel spreadsheet with the login activity, Google Drive activity, admin activity, user activity, as you kind of see in the main pane, but also that alt tab, that full timeline view. And this outputs to Excel because, as we all know, as defenders and incident responders, often our favorite tool is Excel. We all know how to navigate and filter and sort a spreadsheet with advanced skill. And so I thought it would be the best place to dump this data instead of an admin panel, especially if you're working as like an MSSP. You're constantly hopping into different tool sets. Some people have Microsoft, some people have an on-prem solution, some people have G Suite, but most of us know how to navigate a spreadsheet. So in order to validate my research, obviously working on this from an academic perspective, I was going into it thinking about how I proved that I was providing value. So I decided to simulate an account takeover in a real Google Workspace environment. I was able to use one that is actively used day to day so that there'd be plenty of legitimate data. And then I performed some simulated activity, ran the tool I wrote, and kind of, given my background in incident response and my education there, was able to imagine that incident response process and figure out whether the tool output was useful compared to the default logging in Google Workspace. Simulating this activity, how I approached it, pretty simple. I'm not a pen tester. I wasn't performing any advanced simulations and trying to cover my tracks, but I just wanted to get some kind of suspicious data in there that would be highlighted by the tool. So I VPN'd in from Hong Kong, a location that I wouldn't expect to see in my organization's Google Workspace. I logged into an admin account without two-factor authentication, and then I performed some post-compromise activities. Specifically, I sent some emails. I looked around in Google Drive and tried to edit some files, and then I changed the account settings. I'll talk, if in my other talk on Google Workspace IR, I briefly mentioned kind of the persistence of changing account settings to make it harder for the account to be recovered. So I decided to implement those actions. So now I'm going to dive in and kind of show a comparison of all the different logs that we see in Google versus how they turned out in my spreadsheet. And then afterwards, we'll talk about what was the benefits of my view, what were the weaknesses, and how I want to proceed in future. So starting off simple, we look at the login logs. This is the Google Workspace view for the starter level business workspace. Pretty simple. The thing is, looking at this, you see logins. Okay, I know I'm a legit user. I'm logging in, got some IP addresses. I guess I could research those if I wanted. Well, my goal here, by integrating that contextual geolocation information, is now when we look in this spreadsheet, unlike that view over there where we'd have to research the IPs to get more context, I quickly see within a 13-minute period, somehow this user went from Round Rock to Central Hong Kong, which could easily be highlighted, especially we perform filtering. If you wanted to, if you know all your users should be in the US, then filtering out the US, you'd immediately see all that activity originating from a questionable location. So for me, this was the immediate value added that I saw when I created this tool. We'll talk more about this view later and kind of some of the challenges. This provides that additional contextual data. If we look back in the Google panel, there isn't a lot of information. You can see I logged in, sometimes login verification and login type. We do get similar context, but we actually get some additional methods. So along with seeing that there's a password login type, there's this is suspicious parameter, which funny enough, Google did not find it suspicious that 13 minutes after I logged in from Texas, I suddenly logged in from Hong Kong. So that kind of just shows not to trust the platform's capability to detect it. But if Google did detect it as suspicious, whatever their criteria is for that, we have that parameter where we can filter. And again, we'll go into kind of like how this isn't the greatest method of doing it, because you do have to filter on the content of the cell, rather than just its straight value. Moving on to Drive. So obviously, one of the post-compromise actions that could be performed by an attacker, especially if they're compromising these attacks to find sensitive data, is they're going to log into your Google Drive account and start looking through. Just like how O365 is connected to OneDrive, Google Workspace allows you to have a shared drive. And often if the company is taking advantage of this, all their sensitive documents are going to be in there. So I see a user downloading files from the drive, some PDFs from a shared folder. Again, I see the IP addresses, but who says this isn't just the user themselves doing the activity they should? It seems normal enough. But throwing in that context immediately shows something. While I was doing legitimate activity with Google Drive from Round Rock later in the day, at some point, again, this central Hong Kong user is looking around in Google Drive. Not only does this provide the context, giving that incident response perspective, again, what I think when I see this is not only has the user compromised my account, but now I have sensitive information linked. And this is significant, especially in an industry such as healthcare or finance, where there might be some like HIPAA laws, for example, in place. And we just found the sign that now we have to report this incident to a higher level, because now sensitive patient data was probably leaked. So just some context there of like the significance of this extra context. Looking in, we can see some additional details. So we can see the document ID and what kind of file was opened, document titles, and kind of the visibility of those files before. So it's significant if it's a private file, but you'll see here we did open some PDFs that one file here that was shared externally. So if they're only looking at files that were shared to the public, that is less significant. Moving on to user account audit logs. These are going to be actions you as a user perform in your account. You'll see here that could be disabling two-step verification, changing passwords, emails. In this case, in my testing, I had to disable temporarily two-step verification to kind of show that user enrolling in two-step. What I want to simulate here from an incident response, attacker compromise perspective, the attacker decided to gain persistence by logging in, changing the account recovery email. So as a victim, if I log in, it's saying my password is wrong. That's strange. I try to get a recovery password. I can't, because it's no longer coming to my recovery email. And then let's say I do somehow get access. Well, now I got two-step verification that someone else has set up. Once again, we see the immense value of geolocation. I was in Round Rock, I performed some actions on my account, and all of a sudden, a couple days later, I'm in Hong Kong changing my recovery and enrollment settings. So while geolocation isn't a perfect science, and there can be some variables, I could be using a VPN legitimately, this is still an immediate place compared to looking here and maybe this is normal activity. Now, all of a sudden, okay, well, maybe we should dig in a bit more, especially if you're obviously here. I'm looking at an account where I'm a small business. I just have 4 or 5 users. If I've got 10,000 users, this is the kind of thing that will quickly surface some activity. Last category is these admin audit logs. So for here, this is activity performed at an admin level. Specifically what I did in the attacker mindset, I decided to think, okay, let me search through emails. Again, kind of like looking for those documents. Maybe I can find some sensitive information. From the responder perspective, I'm now seeing what all did they get access to. Oh crap, they're looking at all my emails. Now, what information do they possibly have? Sensitive company information. And as goes with the theme of this entire talk, geolocation. So in this case, it was all legitimate activity, luckily. I'm not too worried. Okay, looks like we're safe at this point. As long as the user was coming from the same IP, same location, they didn't touch our email. And that's kind of that context. I'm creating a timeline, going through it. Okay, they've touched our documents, they've changed account settings. At this point, it doesn't look like they've performed email searches. And admin logs do, like some of those other categories, provide the context. The cool context here that you don't really see as much in this view easily is you're able to see the exact search performed. So the search date ranges they performed and for example, this time they looked for emails specifically sent by this account. One of the things that was really important to me as a responder was the consolidated view. I remembered responding to an incident in the past with Google Workspace and the pain of clicking into each pane, downloading the logs if I wanted them in Excel, having to consolidate them, inconsistencies on the columns that were used. And so one of the first things I thought of how is this going to be more useful to responders than the default pane was, I want that single pane of glass. I want to be able to sort by time and see everything that happened. I want to be able to filter those columns and now look at the activity of interest. So at this point, if I had 10,000 users, I know that the user that was probably compromised is Megan at. I can now go into this consolidated view, just filter that user. Maybe I want to know if any other users were coming from the same IP. If the attacker compromised multiple accounts, I can just filter by IP. I can sort by time in any way. If I know that the initial compromise, I found that point and it happened at a specific time or date, well, let's ditch the logs that I no longer think are relevant because I don't believe the attacker was here. So I think along with the geolocation that we've highlighted provides immense value, this consolidated log view is not only something that Google does not provide in their starter package, and not just something that's useful, but it's also something that responders are likely going to be familiar with. We're familiar with log platforms or Excel outputs where we can filter on a time range. We can filter through these columns and we can see everything without having to have 10 spreadsheets open or 10 browser tabs. So in the end, what did I figure out? So there were definitely some benefits to this tool for me, looking at it as someone who had previously responded to Google Workspace incidents, someone who had gone through a list of 30 IP addresses that were logged in from, posted them all into VirusTotal or geolocation databases, which actually in that incident, the reason my brain first went to geolocation as the first kind of context to provide was a user went from logging into from Tennessee to somewhere in Africa. So that was kind of our first step of, okay, we know who was compromised, but it took me clicking through each IP address, trying to figure out where these IPs were geolocated, instead of immediately just seeing a column that said country. So that was the first thing that I was like, okay, this worked. Second was that single pane of view. Again, like I listed all the benefits of that single pane, we've got that now. One of the things that later came to me that kind of wasn't in my head when I was developing, but then became a thing is, especially in an MSSP environment, or an organization that doesn't have an incident response plan, so they didn't think about giving their incident responders access to these accounts. We're not now mid-incident trying to create an account for the incident responders, sending creds, especially if the attacker is still in the environment and someone's decides to make the decision to send an admin account credentials over the email that the attacker has access to. There's no risk of that because we've got this pre-configured tool that uses a private API key, and a private credentialed file locally. It's all set up so that you can pull this context without having to have a separate user logging in and navigating through those accounts, potentially in an environment where you're trying to attack an attacker, not create more activity. And then lastly, this kind of goes to that single pane view too, that common format. If you've never been in a Google Workspace interface, having to figure out that the first time, like I did, having never been in Google Workspace, and then all of a sudden, oh, we're responding to an incident in one of those environments. It would have been a lot more helpful to just have a spreadsheet with the data. So having that common format where you don't have to worry about your incident responders being trained in that tool. There were some downsides though. As you probably saw, those parameter columns where it was a JSON blob with various information, they kind of sometimes got complicated and cluttered depending on the view. Ideally, I'd like to clean up those views instead of having columns named params, having those columns appropriately named with the values. The challenge there, of course, is depending on the logs, there's going to be different columns, merging that into a consolidated view. But that's all stuff that while I wasn't able to do it in the time frame of my white paper research, I'd like to be able to clean up those views for the tool itself. The second downside is requiring the API setup, especially if you're in a small business that chose Google Workspace for ease of use. Then telling them how to set up an API key in order to allow this might be a tiny bit of a challenge, require some hand holding, but I'm hoping the step-by-step instructions I have in the README provides that ease of use. And if not, I believe there's work that can be done there to make that simpler for everyone. So my proposed improvements, I want to clean up those views, especially the JSON blobs, get them all into their own own columns. I want to add more enrichment. We just saw alone the one enrichment tool I have in there is geolocation. Well, what if I now compare those IP addresses to a list of IPs on the spam blacklist or VirusTotal content tags, any hits there? Again, that will quickly allow us to narrow down. While I won't necessarily highlight everything, if we've got an attacker who knows to VPN from the state or city that company headquarters are in, the geolocation might not highlight it. Not every IP that's malicious is on a malicious blacklist or spam list. Even though that's the case, this is going to still speed up in a lot of cases, narrowing in where we can start that focus. There are more logs than what I showed here. I decided to go with the logs that I thought would be most used to the user. But we have logs such as API logs, single sign-on logs, app activity, third-party application activity logs. All of these may contain evidence that we want to use, that we, as incident responders, it may contain breadcrumbs of what the attacker did in the environment. If for somehow they compromise the environment versus via a third-party tool, that might be significant. So there are logs that we can expand to get additional context. Again, I just started with the ones that I thought would be of most value. And lastly, getting more into contextual highlighting. Like I said, it's easy for a responder to go in there, filter out the US, kind of see what's happening. But what if they log into that spreadsheet and this color context can be done, highlighting can be done with Python. But what if they go in and the program has some sort of ability to say, okay, well, if they logged in from Texas at 2 p.m. and then they logged in from Asia at 3 p.m., we should probably put some eyes on this activity and have that highlighted in red. Okay, well, here's some starting points for you. Or let's say I add enrichment for virus total. Automatically highlight that row that has 20 detections for that IP address as a spam. So again, just making the response time so much faster by bringing the responder's eyes. Incident responders are important. We have to put together that story. We have to figure out what's going on. But the more obvious data that can be risen to their attention to give them a starting point, I think it's great to have that. So just a quick overview, the custom tool, its first steps was to add a single pane view, geolocation, which allows for quicker identification of that malicious activity, both from the context perspective and the ease of use, the visibility that responders can have in one view. But that being said, for its value to really increase, to be able to make a responder say, okay, let's go ahead and use this response tool versus, you know what, like not worth setting up, not enough value added, just log in, click through the panes. I think there is some value that should be added, such as additional context highlighting, and just cleaner views overall that are easier to navigate. That being said, this code is open source. I dropped it in Slack, the hallway channel that I'm in. So any of you who would like to look at that code and try it out, you're welcome to. There's instructions for setting up that API. And as Chad will probably mention, I'll be in the hallway for the next, probably the rest of the day. I gotta go to work, but I'll have it open, ready to answer questions if any come up.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Great talk. Very cool tool as well. You know, a lot of these tools come from that kind of scratch and itch. We've got a couple more minutes. If you can stay on, I've got a couple of questions that we have queued up for you. One question that came up, and I may have missed this, but I figure it's worth re-asking. Do any of those logs, do you know if they also provide the user agent for where the request came from?
Not that I know. I was actually really hoping that the API, the background information, would highlight more information than the logs in there, but they actually are not, which is unfortunate because that would be something cool to see, especially with brute force tools that leave behind that information.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully maybe that's something that they can add in the future. I know they continue to evolve the amount of information they have. Question came in as well on ingesting these logs into a SIM or some other kind of an aggregation tool. I've done very similar things to what you've described, where it's that scratch and itch. I need to write the tool. I'm going to do the enrichment. I've done a lot of stuff like you mentioned with GeoIP as well. Is there anything that you've seen where putting this into some kind of a SIM or an aggregator can increase the value, increase the context? Of course, the underlying assumption there is if you have that kind of an additional tooling available.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of just started with Excel spreadsheet, is the universal availability to everyone. And actually, an interesting point on that is when I was researching this, I did not see a large number of sims that automatically had an app available, the quick easy button it. But I suppose if your sim has auto enrichment tools, for example, Splunk, how you can use, and it's been a long time since I've touched Splunk, so I can't remember the terminology, but how you can integrate like geolocation on all IPs, regardless of logs. Obviously, that would provide that additional context without the need. So yes, it is possible if you have a sim that some enrichment can take place given built-in enrichment tools.
Yeah, definitely. I know one of the projects that I use that I helped develop is Soft Elk, and we do similar kind of like, hey, if it's called source IP, we're going to go ahead
Yeah.
and do the enrichment. So, hey, if it's JSON, then
Yeah.
grab JQ, grab everything that you need to parse that out. And what I love is that you took this tool, and the sky's the limit at this point.
Yeah.
You can really do all kinds of additional stuff, and we're always extremely thankful for the work for folks such as yourself that provide the open source tools, because not only does it become accessible to everybody, even if you don't have that billion-dollar sim product or license, and it's also something you can provide back. You can feed back into it, give a couple of pull requests, which I know are always
Exactly.
appreciated.
Yes.
Um, there's a couple of other comments that I think are questions that were in kind of the same category, which is, hey, what about insert cloud provider here other than the Google Workspace? Well, the good news is that there's a lot of other similar projects for those, and certainly some
Yeah.
lessons learned that I think you're seeing in this could be applied out to some of those. So I don't know if you have the plans to do that, but I will also mention that that's another great opportunity for folks to support a community project with additional parsing.
Yeah, for sure. And that was kind of my thing is that one, the bigger providers like O365, I found their log views and their capabilities built in are better. And two, if you search O365 forensics or incident response, and then you search G Suite or Google Workspace, sorry, the name changed like mid research project. And then you search Google Workspace incident response, I assure you the number of hits will be vastly different. So that was kind of my goal as a researcher. Where can I provide the most value added? So it wasn't exactly in the view at this time, just because my goal was to focus on an area that has been neglected.
Yeah, well, that's definitely I like that approach.
Yeah.
It's the areas where we need the work to be done, and hey, let's do that work instead of just lament that it doesn't exist. So, um, one other question in here that I think will take us right up to the time. I'm curious your thoughts on this. I have personally been fascinated with seeing the progression of available logs in a lot of these cloud providers, and you don't even have to go back to the back in my day kind of pre-times, but we didn't get logs from a lot of these SaaS and other types of providers, and now we're seeing that we can. Now that the defaults are a little bit more robust, but not perfect, like we talked about with the user agent. Question came in on, is it possible for someone with admin rights to decrease the logging or to remove some of these artifacts? And I think that's an interesting one to consider. Have you seen that?
That is, yeah, I saw that question and now I'm ready to go do some research into that because I didn't really think of that. I would really hope if you can clear logs that we at least got a Windows event clear log style entry. In terms of log retention, I believe, and I'd have to verify in Google Workspace that everything's kind of set to default and you can't change retention, especially in that starter level. I think it's maybe 3 or 6 months is not long. If you pay more, they have Vault, which will retain those logs. But emails, for example, you can only search back 30 days. So if you got phished 32 days ago, you're kind of never going to find that initial point of compromise. So I definitely need to research about the clearing of logs and those capabilities. I don't remember in the admin panel seeing a clear log button. I don't remember seeing retention setting availabilities, but that's definitely something I'll look into because that was a great question.
Yeah, that's very cool. I'm eager to hear what the results are if you when you're able to share those.
For sure.
In the chat, many pages up because there's a ton of comments and they're good comments.
Yeah, I
We were
will
talking.
answer all questions in the chat, the Slack, if anyone wants to hop in there and ask their
Cool.
questions.
Very cool. Yeah, well, we appreciate that as well. And, hopefully some of those findings that you're able to identify, we gave your Twitter account, pinned that to the top of the channel.
Perfect.
And certainly something to keep an eye on in terms of your commit history in the project. So,
Yep.
Well, thanks very much, Megan. Always good to catch up with you, and congratulations on the release of the tool and all the great research that you've put into that. I'm very excited to see where you're able to take that in the future as well. So thanks for taking the time to put it together and to share as well.
Yep. Thank you guys for having me.